Okay, no problem.
Well, very good. Welcome tonight. It's Brother Wolf, and this is HS 345, our healthcare finance course. Um, we are doing case study 6 again, so just a reminder to the class. Um, there are two groups that are doing this case study, as well as each of you as an individual student are doing the case study if you're not in a group. Um, as I mentioned in the recording for group 1, which went on Monday, each of you are to watch both recordings, kind of analyze it and process it in your own mind, compare it to the work that you're doing or did do, and then start asking questions on the discussion board and try to ask the groups, why did you assume this, or how did you estimate that, and why did you decide this? So these case studies are not like 2 plus 2 equals 4, and that's the only answer. You just need to be able to justify your reasoning and your thinking and kind of work through it as if this were a real scenario that you're faced with in the job market or in the employment world. So with that said, I'm going to turn the excuse me, I'm going to turn the time over to Mackenzie, and feel free to start when you guys are ready.
Okay, thanks, Brother Wolf. So we're group 2, and again, we're doing the case study number 6 on the Columbia Memorial Hospital, and our group members are Stephen, Brianne, George, and myself, Mackenzie. Next slide, please. So a little bit of background on Columbia's walk-in clinic. The Columbia Memorial Hospital has a specific walk-in clinic that's about 2 miles away from the hospital. It's an urgent care center, so dealing with different kinds of care, whether it's an illness or a last-minute injury. They deal with that kind of treatment there. Currently, it is severely understaffed by physicians. They've had their bare minimum there for the last few years here, and they currently have a patient load of 45 daily, which is about 40 patients short of their total capacity being 85 per day. And they've also been losing roughly about 3,100 per month in profit there. So there's profit losses. So really the question that we're left with based on this clinic is, how can we improve the clinic financially? What are our options, and what can we do to help this clinic here? Next slide, please. So the options for finding the best solution, the first is to go ahead and just close the clinic. The second would be to continue to operate as is without a marketing program expansion, just to continue on just the way it is without any changes. And the third option would be to continue to operate with a marketing program. This program is based on the marketing director. She had an idea of putting into place a marketing program expansion that would hopefully would bring in more patients, so higher volume, and basically just help bring up the numbers of the clinic. However, with that, there are also trade-offs and costs. So that is another option, but again, it would be a matter of choosing which one of those three. Next slide.
And I'm Stephen. And question 1 goes to whether the clinic, if they keep operating at the normal level that they're at, is if they will continue to make a profit. So what I did is I made a profit and loss statement or an income statement for the average of 2010, and we can see that at the bottom of that, the gross margin percentage has a loss of 5.46%. And so that's with the number of visits at 1,350 a month and their net revenue at 54,000. Next slide, please. And so with no change in volume, the clinic is forecasted to not make a profit. They will be losing money. However, if they wanted to continue the same way they were doing, not change anything, they could possibly look into different ideas for conservation, frugality, and maybe marketing through word of mouth. It's a free option, and possibly could boost their revenue. Next slide, please. And now this slide describes the data without the marketing plan, and it shows what they need to do to break even. And so as we can see, I split it up according to month. It's just basically an income statement per month for the year of 2010. And I used the figures in our case study for January and February of 2010, and then I used the average figures from March through December of 2010. And the number of people they need to add to their patient category each day is about 3 people. So we can see that I added 3 people a day, so I did 3 times 30 days a month, so that adds about 90 people a month to their patient category, which gives the clinic a profit of 1.5%. So that's what we concluded that they would need, is 3 people a day to break even. Next slide, please.
This is George. So I just used that data that Stephen had from his Excel sheet there to create a graph showing our break-even point. And just as everyone knows, the break-even would be the fixed cost divided by the contribution margin, or in other words, the fixed cost divided by the amount of per patient revenue subtracted by the per patient variable cost. And so then we found out our break-even point was 1,423 patients per month. So assuming that the new marketing plan is implemented in the clinic, we went ahead and created an Excel spreadsheet as well with all of the fixed costs and variable costs that are included in that, and created a break-even point. And with that, we concluded that it would take 2,448 patients with the new marketing plan for us to break even. The reason is because the new marketing plan brings in a lot more cost, marketing fees and other things that go with it. So I just went ahead and it looks like it won't change to the next slide here. I'm having a bit of a hiccup.
If you want, maybe you can take it out of presenter mode. I know that'll make the slides slightly smaller, but maybe that might help you advance if you need. I don't know exactly.
Okay. Yeah, not sure what happened, but yeah. So I just went ahead and divided what it would take to find the daily visits for us to break even, and that concluded to be an additional 36 daily visits for us to break even there, and so that would create a daily volume of 81 patients per day. Let's see what here.
All right. So this question has to deal with the malpractice insurance. Question 7, whether, well, it says that we found out that the 3215 monthly malpractice insurance charge is based on an accounting allocation scheme that divides the hospital's total annual malpractice insurance costs by the total annual number of inpatient days and outpatient visits to obtain a per episode charge. So we concluded that this allocation scheme does make a difference in our decision of the break-even analysis. Since the monthly malpractice insurance is a fixed cost, it will rise as the clinic receives more patients on a daily basis. So whether you have 5 patients or 80 patients, your percentages will remain the same of how much you're paying to your malpractice insurance according to how many patients you have in your facility at that time. Next slide, please.
Okay, and for question 8, we were asked, after all the work performed thus far in the analysis, you suddenly realize that the hospital, as a for-profit corporation, must pay taxes. what impact does tax status have on your break-even analysis? The question is pretty straightforward. We just simply said with the Columbia Walk-In Clinic being a for-profit corporation, having to pay taxes, income taxes, would delay the clinic of reaching the break-even point. Again, just another cost that we would have to be dealing with and take that into account that would set us back from hitting that break-even point. So as well as just dealing with the added cost of taxes in general, and a higher volume, again, of patients would be needed in order to reach the break-even point as well. The next slide.
Okay. For question 9, there was 2 parts of it, and the first part has to deal with does the clinic have value to the hospital, more than just monetary value. The clinic provides a valid bridge between the primary care physician and emergency room services. It's best for, less serious situations like colds, fevers, sprains, and more serious situations like strokes and heart attacks need to go to the hospital emergency department. If the hospital is able to focus more on the patients that require more attention, that really is a benefit to the hospital. Another important advantage is that with the better use of the urgent care, there's a shorter wait time at the ER, reducing the stress of both patients and staff, as the clinic has the capacity to be better utilized, further easing the patient load at the hospital emergency room services. So if they can, through word of mouth and letting people know that the urgent care clinic is there, then as more people utilize it, then the stress that the hospital has in dealing with those non-really emergent cases would really benefit the hospital as well. And the second part of question 9, should the actions of Baptist Hospital have any bearing on the decision on keeping the clinic open? The Baptist Hospital's recent purchase of the physician's practice should have no bearing on the decision to keep the walk-in clinic open. And we really feel that because people who are going to see their primary care physician are going to schedule an appointment rather than go in for something they really urgently need to have taken care of, or if they can't get into their physician, that's what a walk-in is for. So they almost are really serving 2 different populations, even though it's the same area. Both of these clinics should be able to accommodate the area without having an impact on one another if they're used appropriately. Next slide. Okay, our final recommendation is that the walk-in clinic should operate just as it is without the added marketing plan. And if they bring in the additional 2 patients per day, then they could have the profitability that they need to break even. Additionally, if it continues to, we did a little analysis on the inflation rate, going off the average inflation rate of 3.22%, and found that if it just operates as it is, even without adding the 3 additional patients per day, the clinic will still become profitable by 2012, which is an incentive to kind of just leave it the way it is. Closing the clinic is just an increased cost because of the penalty for canceling the lease, as well as unemployment, and then it's just hard on communities when you close a clinic like that. It gives them one less place to go, and it would also be kind of a hardship on the emergency department. In regards to the marketing plan, it's an expensive, time-consuming process, and there will need to be a significant increase in the number of patients in order to cover the cost, and that's not really helpful. I mean, it's almost double the patients that they're currently seeing, and that's a lot of patients coming through the door. And even then, there's not really enough evidence that would show that they would be able to get that many people to come through the door to increase the profits. So it's kind of a risk to go with the marketing plan. And so our recommendation is to keep the clinic working as it is. And that is all.
Very well done. You guys did a very nice job. I want to really point out to the class that's going to listen to the recording, pay attention to how well the group did a succinct. In the real world, you don't get, and I kind of told the group, you try to finish within 15, 20 minutes or so. Because in the real world, you don't really get much time. You're meeting, you're asked to do an analysis. You have to maybe present to the CEO or the CFO or some sort of executive leadership. You need to kind of get to the point, like you guys did. Be confident in your analysis. Obviously, they're going to ask questions. I'm not going to do a lot of that kind of probing right now, but maybe a little bit more on the discussion board. So be kind of ready to defend, your reasoning and your thinking a little bit. And I encourage the rest of the class to also ask those kind of clarifying questions. If we could go just for a moment to the slide, I think it's slide number 8. Yeah, so the only thing is on the x-axis there, I see you have like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and a 6, and in between 5 and 6 you have this number, 2,448. It may just be an artifact that, or some sort of automatic labeling of the Excel file or the graphing tool that you used, but that is a little confusing to me, and not sure if you just might not have been able to change those numbers, or do those numbers represent something? It's just a little awkward to me to see, a 5 and a 6, and then in the middle you've got this 2448. Did that come up at all?
No, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Not something that I had thought about when I was making the graph. It was a graph that I just generated from the Excel sheet.
Yeah, no problem. So if one thing you may want to consider doing is, if it's not too much work, maybe play with those the template or whatever that you used to see if you can get that to make a little more sense. Because somebody who might not be as, I don't know, in tuned or aware of the details as you guys are that did the actual analysis might say, hey, that just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't get that. But I really like the clarity of the graphs, and you guys really followed the way that I think you should do. And then on, I think it's slide 11, let me just ask you this. Is there any other value? I think the question is question 9. So what you talked about, the value of it kind of being a bridge between primary care and emergency room, and that the less serious can be provided in the clinic and more serious in the ER. Any other benefits? So let's say we do take your recommendation, and just you're kind of recommending just keep doing what the current status quo is. And if I were the CFO, I'd say, well, why should I do that? I'm losing money. Are there some other intangibles that maybe are harder to measure that you might bring up to kind of defend? Well, there's other value, and even maybe financial value, but we just aren't able to measure it right now. What else does anything kind of come to mind? Like, it might not directly show up on the clinic's profit and loss type of statements, but could there be some sort of financial gain that the hospital's getting just because the clinic's out there in the community?
Well, I mean, there's just the cost of just seeing a less serious patient. I mean, you have to, there's so many, like between the nurse and just getting in the room prepped and whatever, there's still all sorts of items that just having someone in the room, they all have to be stripped down, cleaned up before the next patient can come in. And without having to see those less serious situations in the ER and letting the clinic go ahead and do that in that smaller setting that is really more catered to that, then the hospital really doesn't have to have. I mean, it's a higher cost also to the patient as well. I mean, it's just all around, it's just a more financially sound for both the patient and the hospital to have them seen at the urgent care. And part of that is that when we're talking about the word of mouth, like maybe if it's kind of a group, the Columbia hospital system between the hospital and this clinic, it would be important to try to note that if you do have a not very serious situation come in, maybe you let them know, hey, 2 miles down the road, there's this urgent care clinic. You might want to give it a try next time. You might not have to wait in the ER department that long. And those types of things would probably help to push that urgent care to be used more often and reduce the cost to the ER.
Yeah, that's a great example. I wasn't even thinking of that one, and I think
I was having another idea in mind as well,
Yeah.
Brother Wolf.
Yeah, go ahead.
Which, yeah, that was a really good point. But I was thinking that a walk-in clinic could also be a way to attract patients who do have a more serious
Yep.
condition. Someone who has chronic headaches could go to a primary care physician or a walk-in clinic and find out that it's a much more serious issue and they need to be admitted into a hospital.
Yep. That's exactly right. And but I really appreciate. I don't know who gave the first example. Was that Brianne or was that Mackenzie?
It was Brianne.
Okay, yeah, that was a great example that I wasn't even thinking of. What you kind of said is that the hospital can refer patients to the clinic, right? And the logic there is reducing cost, and that's a great way to think of it. And the one that I was thinking of is kind of maybe more obvious, but I think the answer you gave is really smart. But I was thinking along the lines of what George was thinking too is it can go the opposite direction too, right? That a patient might go to the clinic and it can be a referral center or source for the hospital. Not everything in the hospital has to be done inpatient either, but the walk-in clinic probably doesn't have a CT scanner or an MRI or, maybe they don't have, nerve testing and those sorts of outpatient services that the hospital might. And so having the clinic out there might be a way to say, hey, we don't do these more advanced tests here at the clinic, but guess what? Just 2 miles away is our hospital. We do outpatient services there, and the issue that you have might need a workup at the hospital. So it can be a way of generating revenue for the hospital. It doesn't show up, those benefits are going to be financial benefits that show up on the hospital's financial statements. But if you don't have this clinic, then that might go to, those types of services might go to a competitor. So both of those are really great examples.
Yeah,
The
Brother
one
Wolf, I have a
Yeah, please.
I have a real life example of that. What George was saying. I'll just make it quick. About a year ago, my wife had stomach pain, and she had no idea what it was. She let it sit for like a day and a half. So we went to the clinic. It's like an urgent care, and they looked at it and they immediately knew that it was her appendix and that she needed it removed. So they then sent her to the hospital that night, and the next day she had an appendectomy. And so that's a perfect example of a patient going into the clinic, then having to get admitted to the hospital for a much more serious issue.
Yeah. And what do you recall in that instance? Was the clinic a part of the hospital system? Like, was it under the same ownership, or were they different?
No, it was a completely different building, different ownership. Yeah, it was like a UMC clinic,
Okay.
and we went to a local hospital here in town.
So in that case, the clinic kind of helped out this other entity, just in a way of being a referral source. And
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that. I was going to share what happened to me in the fall. I had some pain. I went, and it was on a Saturday or a Sunday. I went into the urgent care clinic that was open for those reasons. It wasn't life-threatening, but I wanted it checked out. They did that, and they said, you know what? The definitive study that you need done is an ultrasound. It's a kind of ultrasound that we don't do here in the clinic. You really should go to the ER. And I went to the ER that they recommended, which was a hospital that is owned by the same entity that owned the clinic. So in that circumstance, it's kind of doing what I was suggesting, which is it's owned by this parent organization that you're kind of generating revenue for the hospital, and if I had gone to a different walk-in clinic, they may have referred me to a different hospital. So all good points.
Yeah,
again,
and
Brianna.
I was just going to add to that, Brother Wolf, just before you switch gears. I think with that, because one thing that I noticed with reading the case study is that they mentioned that Columbia has been, highly profitable because of its well-appointed facilities, the medical staff, reputation for quality care. So I'm thinking, if they're under the same entity, despite, even though this walk-in clinic has, at least financially doesn't seem to be doing so well, even the fact to be able to refer patients to, a sister, a sister location that, just to be able, just to not leave that patient, like, oh, well, I guess we could try to find you, some other, some other clinic by somebody else, and, they should be okay, but knowing, the reputation, the mission statement of that same entity, I think brings comfort to patients knowing they're not just being sent to some other random location. So I think that just makes a big difference too with that.
Yep, and some of these arguments can't always be made with dollars and cents, and it's kind of an intangible in some cases. You need to at least be able to make the theoretical argument sometimes that, kind of like you're saying, the mission is to treat the community, and we as an organization don't just have hospitals. We have these other services that in and of themselves and standing by themselves might not make money, but they're kind of fulfilling part of what our mission is, and we're going to count as a one organization. So we might eat it over here, but we're going to make up for it over here. So those are things you do have to consider.
I wonder if there is a way to measure that, though, by doing a survey for the patients that are admitted into the hospital, and or I'm sure there's some way to track it, and just find the revenue that's generated.
Yeah, and actually there are. It's a little bit more complicated than what we would go over in this class, but there are ways, and larger systems do exactly this. They're not going to just trust that it might work. They actually measure these sorts of things. They see what the referral source is, and if they have like shared electronic systems or medical systems, they'll see that patient. So in my example, this was all Intermountain Healthcare, and they'll see that I registered or checked in at an urgent care clinic, and they can follow that data to their hospital. And so some of these things, when you get integrated healthcare networks, that's part of their strategy, is to be able to have that data on hand and do these kinds of studies and not just guess and not just use anecdotal evidence. They then will actually crunch those numbers and see if it actually works out. So there are ways to do that. Sometimes the investment and the cost in doing that might be a little bit of money, but if they're big enough and they've got enough of these urgent care clinics over like a large metropolitan area, then they usually do put forth that effort, and they study these things. So and these things are studied by professional organizations, and you'll find it in the literature, and you'll find studies like this. So it pays to actually be thinking about these in a thoughtful, scientific way, as opposed to just kind of an anecdotal way. And the more sophisticated systems won't rely on anecdotal. They're going to insist on these more thoughtful studies. One other thing to keep in mind is if you go back to your very first, I think it was your very first slide, it was question 1. Or maybe it was slide 2. It was it's slide 5. Yeah, it's kind of hard for me to see the numbers right now, but when you were presenting it, be able to defend. I'll have to study this a little bit, and maybe I'll post on the discussion board, but I came up with a little bit higher number to break even.
For the gross margin percentage?
Yeah, and and it may just be, the data I used versus and the assumptions I made and those sorts of things. So I'm going to study that a little bit more, and what I would ask you to do is to ask the other group why they came up with their break-even number that's different than yours, and kind of work through that in the discussion board, and maybe not just the other group, but actually ask some of the students, and you may need to clarify for some of the students, how you came up with your break-even number. Again, I'm not holding people to coming up with the answer that I came up with. You just need to be aware that people will come up with different answers, and in the real world, you need to be prepared to be able to say why you did or didn't. So just be thinking of that on the discussion board, because you're going to get all sorts of different opinions. Ask other people, well, how did you come up with it? This is how we came up with ours. We used a whole year's worth of data, or whatever it may have been. Those types of discussions, I think, are really valuable.
All right, awesome. Thanks.
But really, great job. I really liked it. So thank you so much for doing that. Any last minute comments or questions?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so if one of you would post the slides, once this recording finishes its processing, I'll post the link maybe later this evening or early tomorrow. And then just monitor the discussion board and engage others in that process. So thank you.
All right, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Night.
Bye-bye.